What if I told you that one of the richest countries on earth just delivered a message to Washington that sounded less like a diplomatic request and more like a warning? A warning that, if ignored, could send shockwaves through the global financial system, drive borrowing costs higher across America, and expose a vulnerability that has been hiding in plain sight for decades. Because in April, the United Arab Emirates approached the U.S. Treasury and asked for a financial lifeline. And stripped of all diplomatic language, their message amounted to this: help us, or we will have no choice but to crash your bond market. 2 weeks ago, I told you that the United States was fighting two wars: one that everybody can see, and one that almost nobody can. Last week, that invisible war drew its first blood. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear could define the next 12 months of market activity. In a video called Two Wars, I laid out a vulnerability in the United States Treasury market that most investors never think about, but one that I am now convinced will become one of the most important financial stories of our time. Let's do a quick recap because this part really matters. When the United States government spends more money than it collects in taxes, which it does every single year to the tune of trillions of dollars, it borrows the difference. And it does this by selling IOUs called treasury bonds. A 10-year treasury bond is simply a promise from the US government to pay you back in 10 years with interest. These bonds have long been considered the safest investment in the world because, in theory, the US government will always pay its debts. As a result, countries around the world, Japan, the United Kingdom, China, South Korea, and dozens of others, hold roughly $9.4 trillion worth of these American IOUs. They bought them because treasuries are safe, liquid, and denominated in US dollars, the currency every country needs to transact globally. For decades, this system worked beautifully. The United States could borrow cheaply, and foreign governments could park their savings in a safe asset. Everybody won. The system works perfectly until everybody needs their cash back at exactly the same time. Let me ask you a question. If you were running Japan's central bank and your country was staring down an energy crisis that threatened to shut down factories, power plants, and shipping routes, and you needed dollars immediately to buy oil on the open market, what would you sell first? You would sell your most liquid dollar denominated asset. You would sell US treasuries. And that is exactly what is beginning to happen. Many countries have been impacted by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Their oil and energy supplies have been disrupted. They need to raise dollars to buy fuel on the open market. Foreign central bank holdings of treasuries at the New York Federal Reserve have fallen to their lowest level since 2012. Countries short on energy and desperate for dollars are selling American government bonds to raise cash. Japan holds roughly $1.2 trillion in treasuries. The United Kingdom holds approximately $895 billion. These are not small positions. And here is the problem. When lots of people sell the same asset at the same time, the price drops. When the price of a treasury bond drops, its interest rate, what Wall Street calls the yield, goes up. That yield is the incentive investors receive for lending money to the US government. And because treasury yields set the baseline for borrowing costs across the entire economy, everything becomes more expensive. Mortgages, car loans, corporate debt, government refinancing, all of it. Let me break this down simply. Put yourself in the position of the US government. You spend more than you earn, so you need to borrow money to pay your bills. Let's say I lend you $1,000 and you agree to pay me 5% interest or $50 a year for 5 years. I'm earning interest, and after 5 years, I get my $1,000 back. Sounds like a good deal, but 2 years into that arrangement, I suddenly need cash. The problem is that you don't owe me the money back for another 3 years. So I look for someone willing to buy the loan from me. I find a third party and tell them this person owes me $1,000. They're paying me 5% per year. The full amount comes due in 3 years. Buy the loan from me and you'll receive those payments. But the buyer knows I'm desperate. So instead of paying me $1,000, they offer me only $800. I need the money. So I take the deal. Think about what just happened. That buyer paid $800 for something that will eventually return $1,000 plus interest. Their effective return, their yield, just increased because they paid less for the same stream of payments. Now, imagine this happening not with one lender, but with entire countries. Japan, the United Kingdom, South Korea, all desperate for dollars, all selling treasuries at the same time, all willing to accept less than full value. And we're not talking about thousands of dollars. We're talking trillions. Why is that a problem? Because the United States is still spending more than it earns. It still needs new loans. But if investors can buy an existing treasury bond for $800 on the open market, why would they pay the US government $1,000 for a brand new one? They wouldn't, which means the government must offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. Its borrowing costs rise precisely when it can least afford them. And because treasury yields influence nearly every other interest rate in the economy, suddenly mortgages, car loans, corporate debt, and government financing all become more expensive at the same time. This is the predicament. The United States needs higher yields to attract lenders, but higher yields can damage the economy those lenders are financing. And this brings us back to the UAE. In late April, the United Arab Emirates approached the US Treasury and requested a wartime financial lifeline. The UAE is one of the foreign holders of treasuries we just discussed. The Strait of Hormuz had effectively been closed for roughly 12 weeks. That meant the UAE could not sell oil the way it normally would. And while the country had not run out of wealth, its cash flow had been severely disrupted. The UAE holds approximately $95.6 billion in U.S. treasuries. It has around $270 billion in foreign exchange reserves, and it controls trillions more through sovereign wealth funds. This is not a poor country, but when cash flow stops, even wealthy countries start drawing on their savings. And if the UAE had done that by selling its treasury holdings, it would have dumped tens of billions of dollars worth of bonds into an already stressed market. Bond prices would have fallen, yields would have risen, and the debt spiral we just described would have accelerated. The UAE would have become the country that started it. So instead, they approached Washington with a proposal, effectively saying, "We did not ask for this crisis. We were dragged into it. If we run short on cash and you refuse to help us, we will have no choice but to raise it ourselves." And you know exactly what that means for your bond market. So the UAE requested a short term loan known as a currency swap line. A swap line is an emergency credit facility that allows the Federal Reserve to lend dollars directly to a foreign central bank. Many people will describe this as a bailout. I see it differently. I see it as a bailout of the Treasury market itself. The Federal Reserve lends dollars. The foreign central bank pledges its own currency as collateral at a fixed exchange rate. When the loan matures, the foreign central bank returns the dollars with interest. Historically, swap lines have been repaid, at least technically. But in 2013, the Federal Reserve quietly changed several major swap agreements from temporary arrangements to permanent facilities. And that raises an interesting question. What is the practical difference between a loan that never gets repaid and a loan that never matures? I'll leave that for you to decide. My prediction is straightforward. Over the next year, the swap line program will expand dramatically. The list of eligible countries will grow. The roster will move beyond traditional allies and begin including countries with less stable currencies and weaker financial systems. At the same time, more temporary swap lines may quietly become permanent. And in that environment, loans are no longer repaid in any meaningful sense. They are simply rolled over. Wall Street even has a name for this strategy: amend, extend, and pretend. You amend the terms, you extend the deadline, and you pretend everything is fine. The evidence that this process is beginning will be simple. First, the UAE gets its swap line. Then Kuwait gets one. Why Kuwait? Because oil revenues fund roughly 90% of Kuwait's government budget. And if energy exports remain disrupted, Kuwait faces the same problem. Kuwait holds roughly $66 billion in U.S. treasuries. It can either sell those treasuries and risk contributing to the debt spiral, or it can follow the UAE's lead and ask Washington for dollars directly. Which brings us to the question that will dominate headlines. Is a swap line a bailout? Critics will say yes, supporters will say no. And in a strange way, both sides are right. A swap line looks like a bailout for the borrower because the borrower receives dollars, but the true beneficiary is often the lender because the alternative is a forced sale of US treasuries. Bond prices fall, yields rise, Washington's borrowing costs climb, and the debt spiral accelerates. So when the Federal Reserve opens a swap line, it is not merely helping a foreign central bank. It is preventing that central bank from becoming a forced seller of US government debt. In other words, it may not be a bailout of the borrower. It may be a bailout of the treasury market itself. And if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, the question is not whether more countries will need dollars, they will. The question is whether Washington allows them to sell treasuries to raise those dollars or quietly lends them the dollars first. That is why the UAE matters so much. It is not the end of the story. It is the first domino. And if that domino falls, the consequences could reach far beyond the Middle East, far beyond Washington, and far beyond Wall Street. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because the story unfolding behind the Treasury market may become one of the biggest financial developments of the decade. The headlines will focus on wars, oil, and politics. But beneath the surface, another battle is being fought, one over dollars, debt, and the future stability of the global financial system. And as new developments emerge, we'll be here to break them down and explain what they mean before everyone else catches on.